He vanished into the mountains, and when they found him, his boots were still warm, but the castle door was locked from the inside. High on a jagged Austrian cliff, surrounded by forests that swallow sound and storms that roll in without warning, stands Hohenwerfen Castle, an ancient stronghold that has watched 1,000 years of secrets unfold. Tourists today see postcard beauty, medieval walls glowing in the sun, a place where falcons glide between turrets. But beneath that charm lies a darker truth. This fortress was never built for comfort. It was built to keep the world out, and to keep certain people in. For centuries, the families who ruled here lived in a state of uneasy privilege. They controlled trade routes, collected wealth, shaped politics. Yet many of them paid for that power with something far more fragile: their sanity, their safety, their bloodline. Because once you entered Hohenwerfen, the mountain had a way of deciding who left. The story begins nearly 1,000 years ago, when the castle was first carved into the rock outcrop by the powerful Archbishopric of Salzburg. It wasn't only a defense post. It was a statement, a warning to anyone who dared challenge church authority. Positioned high above the valley, it controlled everything: trade, military movements, and the fate of villages below. But there's a lesser-known fact. Early records describe the fortress as a holding place for the unruly, an unusual phrase that historians still debate. Was it a prison? A sanctuary? Or something far more sinister? By the 1400s, the fortress had already developed a chilling reputation. Chronicles mention disappearances, men summoned to the castle who were never seen again. Others returned different, silent, hollow-eyed, unwilling to speak of what they had witnessed. One document from 1463, rarely cited, refers to rooms beneath the rock where no man should linger. No blueprints of these chambers exist today, but fragments of tunnels discovered in the 1970s suggest the archives may have been telling the truth. Yet the darkest era was still to come. The 16th century brought political turmoil that swept across Europe like wildfire. Noble families betrayed each other for land, for titles, for survival. And Hohenwerfen became the stage for one of the most shocking betrayals of its age. Count Lucas von Werfen, heir to a respected local dynasty, vanished inside the castle after being summoned for a private meeting. Officials claimed he fled his duties. His wife insisted otherwise. She said a sealed letter arrived at her home 2 days later, signed by Lucas, yet written in a handwriting she swore was not his. And then, almost as if to seal the tragedy, the castle's east tower caught fire. Flames burned for 3 days. When the smoke finally cleared, investigators found no body, no remains, nothing. Only a scorched room with a floor that, according to one witness, was hotter than any fire could have made it. A strange detail historians quietly skip over. But perhaps the most unsettling pattern is this: every time the castle changed hands, misfortune followed. A noble would rise, and then crumble. A family would flourish, and then fracture. Wars spared the structure, but never the people who lived inside it. It's as if the mountain itself demanded payment. In the early 1800s, a surprising fact emerged. A group of explorers reported hearing voices inside the fortress long after it had been abandoned. They described the sound as chanting, rhythmic, echoing, but stopping instantly whenever a door opened. Locals dismissed it as superstition. Yet even today, night guards at the castle occasionally file anonymous reports. Footsteps in empty hallways, distant knocks, whispers in stairwells, carved so narrow that only one person can pass through at a time. Still, the castle endured. Stone does not break easily. And for some families, the promise of isolation was a gift, not a curse. The Werfen lineage, what remained of it, maintained a small claim to the land, though they never again held real power. But the castle's reputation lingered like smoke after the fire. It became known as Europe's most isolated noble residence, not because of geography, but because those who ruled there often found themselves isolated from reality, from allies, even from their own families. And now, as we peel back the layers of this fortress, we approach a moment history rarely discusses. A turning point that would transform Hohenwerfen from a regional stronghold into a place whispered about across Europe. It began with a nobleman who refused to bow to fear, but should have. The young nobleman arrived at Hohenwerfen with confidence carved into every step. Baron Matthias von Hohenberg was known for his charm, his modern thinking, and his stubborn refusal to be intimidated by superstition. He believed the past was a puzzle to decode, not a threat to obey. So when he inherited oversight of the fortress in the mid-1800s, he intended to reshape its legacy, turn it from a relic of fear into a beacon of progress. But Hohenwerfen had a way of bending ambition until it cracked. Matthias arrived with a surprising plan. He wanted to restore the abandoned East Wing, the very section consumed by the unexplained blaze centuries earlier. Locals pleaded with him to reconsider. Workers refused to stay overnight. Even the architect he hired asked to withdraw after only 2 visits, stating privately that the walls move. Matthias dismissed all of it. He wanted answers, not ghost stories. Still, the deeper his team ventured into the old wing, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Behind a collapsed wall, they found an iron ring set into the stone floor, too heavy for any one man to lift, yet clearly used once as some form of restraint. Further inside, they uncovered markings etched into the plaster. Circles, chains, symbols no scholar could confidently identify. At first, Matthias believed these were remnants of medieval punishment chambers. But one artifact changed his certainty entirely. A ledger. A thin book, nearly destroyed by fire, with only a handful of pages intact. On them were names, 6, possibly 7, and short notes beside each. The entries were written in a script unlike typical clerical records. It looked frantic, rushed, as though a hand had been shaking. One line in particular froze Matthias mid-breath. It read, "The mountain demands silence. Do not open the lower door." He had never heard of any lower door. The fortress blueprints showed no such structure. But the ledger suggested that somewhere beneath the ruined East Wing, a hidden chamber existed, a room beyond what anyone alive had seen. And Matthias became obsessed with finding it. At first, his pursuit seemed almost admirable. He worked late into the night, studying maps, digging through forgotten archives, interviewing elderly villagers who remembered stories whispered by their grandparents. One woman, who lived alone near the foothills, said something that unsettled him more than he admitted. She claimed her great-grandfather once worked inside the castle, and that he spoke of a staircase that leads down until the air stops. Another surprising detail emerged. Records from the 1700s referenced a subterranean holding space for men of importance. Not prisoners. Not criminals. Men of importance. Why would a noble residence hide such a chamber? What purpose could it have served? The cliffhanger tightened around Matthias's curiosity. And curiosity became his downfall. Late one evening, he ordered workers to excavate near the eastern courtyard. They protested, he insisted. The first day yielded nothing. The second, nothing. But on the third, as rain turned the dirt to mud, a pickaxe struck hollow stone, a sound that did not belong to any wall on the castle's official plans. The workers backed away. Matthias approached alone. Beneath a layer of earth was a slab, rectangular, perfectly cut, and sealed with iron clamps. When they pried it open, cold air rushed upward with such force that the lanterns flickered violently. Matthias lowered the light inside. The staircase spiraled into darkness. No one spoke. Even he hesitated. Yet the moment was too powerful to resist. He insisted on descending first. The steps were smooth, worn down by centuries of use. The air grew colder. The lantern dimmed against the consuming dark. When he reached the bottom, he found a narrow corridor carved into the mountain itself. And at the very end of that corridor stood a door. Heavy, wooden, reinforced with bands of blackened metal. It looked exactly like the ledger's warning. The lower door. Matthias reached for the handle, driven by the belief that history rewards the bold. But history does not always reward. Sometimes it punishes. Because the moment he touched the iron, something shifted behind it. A sound. A movement. As if someone or something was standing on the other side. Matthias froze. His lantern quivered in his grasp, casting distorted shadows along the stone corridor. The sound behind the lower door had been unmistakable. Soft, deliberate, the kind of movement that only comes from something alive. His workers were already scrambling up the stairs, abandoning tools, abandoning him. Within seconds their footsteps vanished, swallowed by the castle's endless silence. But Matthias stayed. He convinced himself it was an echo, a trick of acoustics within the mountain. Fear, he believed, was only powerful if you let it grow. So he steadied his breath, leaned closer, and pressed his ear against the cold wood. The surface was smooth in some places, clawed in others, as if hands had once scraped for escape. Something about that texture made his pulse tighten. Then came the second sound. A whisper. Soft. Measured. One syllable, stretched thin by time, drifting through the crack in the wood. Matthias couldn't decipher the word, but he felt it, like breath brushing his skin. He stumbled back, the lantern nearly slipping from his hand. Still, he refused to flee. Not yet. He was a nobleman, a rational man, a man who believed every mystery had a human origin. And if something or someone was inside that chamber, he needed to understand why. He climbed back up the staircase and returned at dawn with a smaller, more loyal group of workers. He did not mention the whisper. He did not mention the scratches. He merely ordered them to reinforce the lanterns and bring ropes, tools, and a steel bar to break the lower door open. They obeyed, though unease settled heavily in the room like old dust. But the mountain had other plans. When they descended again, the cold felt different. Not natural cold, but something purposeful, dense, almost aware. Their breath fogged in front of their faces. The door stood exactly as they left it, yet Matthias noticed something new. A faint line of frost across the bottom, as though the air on the other side was far colder than the chamber they stood in. He called for the steel bar. The first strike echoed violently through the corridor. Dust rained from the ceiling. The second strike produced a low groan, wood under strain. But on the third blow, something answered from within. A knock. Wax. One, heavy and slow. Not brittle like old timber shifting. Not random like a falling stone. Intentional. The workers dropped everything and fled. This time, not even Matthias could force them back. They muttered prayers as they scrambled up the steps, refusing to return even for their tools. He watched them go, his heart tearing between fear and fascination. And still he stayed. He approached the door again, this time speaking aloud, his voice wavering in the darkness. Who was in there? Silence. He asked again. Another silence. But as he turned to leave, a sound slid through the wood, faint but unmistakable. The sound of someone breathing. Slow, labored, human, It was enough to break him. He bolted up the stairs, out into the raw daylight, gasping as though he had escaped drowning. The workers refused to meet his eyes. Even the foreman told him plainly, the restoration must end. Whatever lay beneath the eastern wing should remain undisturbed. But Matthias could not stop. Obsession had replaced reason. He shut down communication with the village, forbade anyone from entering the excavation site, and began researching night after night, chasing every scrap of history attached to that ledger. And that's when he uncovered a detail that historians rarely publish. 3 noblemen, each from different regions, each politically valuable, had vanished in the span of 20 years during the late Middle Ages. All 3 were last recorded as having traveled near Hohenwerfen. Their families received letters afterward, claiming they had abandoned their titles and taken religious vows in distant monasteries. But none of those monasteries had records of them. Not one. The signatures on the letters were identical. Identical handwriting, identical phrasing, identical ink. It made no sense. unless the letters hadn't been written by the nobleman at all, but by someone holding them. Matthias felt the air shift around him, the pieces forming a pattern he didn't want to acknowledge. If the lower chamber had been used to confine men of importance, if the ledger warned against opening that door, if breathing still came from behind it, then something or someone had been waiting for centuries, and he was the first to disturb it. But the true horror struck 3 nights later, when a castle guard sprinted into Matthias's study, pale and trembling, claiming he'd seen movement near the ruined wing. Movement where no one was supposed to be. Movement shaped like a man. The guard could barely speak. His breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, his hands trembling as though frost still clung to them. Matthias forced him to sit, demanded clarity, but the man only repeated the same phrase, over and over, as if trapped inside it. There was someone in the courtyard, and he wasn't walking right. That sentence alone would have sounded like drunken panic on any other night. But Matthias saw the terror in the guard's eyes, real, disfiguring terror, and something inside him hollowed. He ordered lanterns lit, a small search party assembled, and they moved into the courtyard of the ruined east wing. Wind scraped across the stones. Clouds drifted low, clinging to the cliffs like restless spirits. Every sound felt magnified, threatening. The men raised their lanterns. Nothing. Just rubble, shadow, and the cold echo of their own fear. But then the guard pointed toward a narrow archway. A pathway leading to the very staircase Matthias had uncovered. His voice cracked. Hay was standing there, watching me. Matthias approached alone. The archway was empty now, the threshold undisturbed. Yet the snow at the entrance was marked by something unmistakable. Footprints. Bare footprints. Human. Leading away from the staircase, not toward it. Not from below. No doubt. They emerged from within the ruined wing, as though someone had climbed out. A disturbing fact clawed at Matthias's thoughts. The chamber was still sealed. The lower door had not been opened. So if anyone had escaped, where had they been all this time? His search party refused to continue, dispersing back into the lit sections of the castle, shaking their heads and muttering about resigning by morning. Matthias remained in the courtyard, lantern flickering, staring at the footprints until the wind began to erase them, grain by grain. Something had shifted. The mystery was no longer contained beneath the castle. It was moving freely above ground. At dawn he summoned a trusted historian from Salzburg. Dr. Emil Hartmann was a calm, skeptical man, famous for debunking legends. If anyone could bring reason into this unraveling nightmare, it was him. But when Hartmann arrived, and Matthias showed him the ledger from the burned east wing, the historian's composure cracked. He recognized the handwriting style, not medieval, as Matthias had assumed, but something older. Something used only in specific clerical circles tied to political imprisonment. Hartmann said the entries resembled records kept for high-value captives. Matthias felt the air leave his lungs. Captives? Here? The historian hesitated before answering. If these entries are authentic, Hohenwerfen may have served a purpose beyond anything recorded publicly. Something involving nobility, blackmail, or removal. But the most chilling discovery came when Hartmann compared the dates in the ledger to Austria's political crises. Each entry aligned with the disappearance of an influential figure. Not criminals. Power brokers. People who threatened the wrong interests. The castle hadn't simply been isolating nobles. It had been swallowing them. The mid-segment cliffhanger was tightening again, but this time Matthias no longer felt like the pursuer. He felt pursued. That night, Hartmann insisted on seeing the lower staircase. Matthias reluctantly agreed. They descended together, accompanied by 2 guards who refused to separate from each other. The cold grew sharper with every step. When they reached the corridor, Hartmann stopped abruptly. The frost along the bottom of the lower door was thicker now, stretching up the wood as if something inside exhaled winter. Matthias touched the surface lightly. It burned with cold. Suddenly, Hartmann leaned closer, his face narrowing with disbelief. He pointed to the iron bands. There, he whispered. Do you see it? Matthias squinted, raising the lantern. The bands were bent. Only slightly. Only at the edges. But undeniably bent, warped outward, as if something inside had pushed against them with tremendous force. Metal that strong should not have yielded at all. The guards bolted without waiting for permission. Matthias and Hartmann were left alone in the suffocating dark. Hartmann swallowed hard, then said what both men were thinking. "If something is in that chamber, it is not dead." Those words echoed long after they ascended back into the daylight. By morning, Hartmann had packed his belongings and announced he was leaving immediately. Some histories, he said, should never be uncovered. But before he stepped through the castle gate, he turned back to Matthias. "There is one more thing you must know," he said. "Those names in the ledger, I recognize one. A nobleman whose disappearance changed an entire succession line. His family never recovered from the scandal. He was said to have vanished on the road to Salzburg, but the handwriting on the letter sent to his family." He paused. "It matches the ledger. Exactly." Matthias felt the ground tilt beneath him. The castle wasn't protecting secrets. It was manufacturing them. And now the thing it once contained was no longer contained at all. Because that evening, just as the sun slipped behind the mountains, a scream tore across the upper courtyard. A guard had seen a man standing on the battlements. A man barefoot and wearing clothes centuries out of date. The scream echoed so violently that even the ravens nesting along the cliffs took flight. Matthias reached the battlements within minutes, lantern in hand, boots slipping on patches of frost that had no business forming in early summer. Two guards clustered near the parapet, refusing to step closer, their faces drained of color. "He was right there," one whispered, pointing to the far corner of the wall. "Watching us." Matthias lifted the lantern. Empty stone. Empty sky. Only the mountain staring back. But something on the ground caught his eye, a faint ring of moisture. Not from rain. From feet. Bare feet. The imprint of toes was still visible, already fading in the rising breeze. Matthias crouched, running his fingers over the cold stone. It felt colder where the footprints had been. Not natural cold, but a metallic chill, like touching the inside of a sealed cellar. He stood slowly. Searched the upper levels. The guards refused. One quit on the spot, dropping his spear and mumbling that nothing human could move that silently. Matthias didn't argue. He couldn't. Because deep inside, he had begun to sense something the others already feared. Whatever had emerged from the lower chambers was not simply lost. It was looking for something. That night, Matthias could not sleep. He paced his study, replaying every piece of evidence: the ledger, the scratched door, the sealed chamber, the bent iron, the bare footprints. Hartmann's final words gnawed at him. Histories that should never be uncovered. But it was too late to retreat. The castle was awake now. And so was something else. Near midnight, Matthias made a decision scholars would later call reckless, desperate, or brave, depending on which historian wrote the account. He gathered a lantern, a journal, and a pistol, not because he believed it would offer protection, but because courage sometimes needs the illusion of preparedness. He descended toward the ruined east wing alone. The corridor felt narrower this time, the air thick enough to taste. Moisture clung to the stone walls in long, trembling streaks. Cold seeped into his skin, as though the mountain were absorbing his warmth. When he reached the lower chamber door, he stopped breathing for a moment. The frost wasn't just thicker. It covered the entire surface now. Vines of ice stretched across the wood like roots, searching for escape. And the metal bands? Bent outward even further. Something had definitely pushed from the inside. Matthias raised the lantern, pressing the flame close to the frost. A faint crackling sound answered, like distant bones shifting. Then, something else. A voice. Not a whisper this time. Clearer. Shallow. Trying to shape words through exhaustion. "Open, please." Matthias staggered back, heart hammering. The voice was unmistakably human, hoarse, fragile, pleading. His rational mind clawed for explanations. a trapped survivor, an echo, a trick of the mountain. But none of those possibilities made sense. The chamber had been sealed for centuries. Even the workers who uncovered the staircase reported no signs of recent disturbance. No one could still be alive, unless they were never meant to live in the ordinary sense. He swallowed hard. "Who are you?" Silence. He tried again, louder. "Who is in there?" A scrape answered. Something dragging across stone. Then a soft thud against the wood, as though a hand, weak but determined, had struck the door. "Release me." Matthias felt the cliff edge beneath his next decision. If he broke the door open, he might uncover a hidden chapter of European history, or he might unleash something history had buried for good reason. Before he could make that choice, a sudden crash above shook the corridor. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Footsteps, fast, stumbling, charged down the staircase behind him. Matthias whirled. A guard appeared, panting wildly. "You must come now," the guard gasped. "Another sighting." Matthias's blood ran cold. "Where?" The guard swallowed hard. "The chapel." Of all places, the chapel was the most isolated room in the fortress, perched against the cliffside, its windows facing nothing but sky. If something wanted to hide or watch, it was the perfect place. They moved quickly, lanterns cutting through the dark. When they reached the chapel, the heavy wooden door was slightly open, just enough to reveal a thin line of darkness within. Matthias nudged it wider. The chapel was empty. Completely, impossibly empty. But on the altar lay something that hadn't been there before. A single piece of parchment. Old, fragile, curled at the edges. Matthias lifted it gently. It was a letter. The handwriting was identical to the ledger, and the signature was from one of the noblemen reported missing nearly 500 years earlier. But the ink, impossibly, was still wet. Before Matthias could speak, the guard behind him let out a strangled cry. There in the corner of the chapel stood the barefoot figure, motionless, half in shadow, eyes fixed directly on Matthias, and wearing a nobleman's coat from the 1500s. The lantern light trembled as Matthias turned toward the figure. For a heartbeat, one long, paralyzing heartbeat, no one moved. The man in the corner stood impossibly still, as if held upright by something other than muscle or will. His coat was torn in places, stiff with age, its embroidery faded but unmistakably noble. His skin was pale, stretched thin, almost translucent in the cold light. And his eyes were not wild or lost. They were steady, focused, as though he had been waiting. Matthias raised the lantern higher. The figure didn't flinch, didn't shield his face. Instead, he exhaled, a slow, fragile breath, and took a single step forward, bare feet whispering against the stone floor. The guard bolted from the room, slamming the chapel door behind him. Matthias didn't move. Couldn't. His mind raced through every possibility, survivor, impersonator, hallucination, but none matched the impossible reality, standing only a few feet away. The man's voice emerged, brittle, strained. "How long has it been?" Matthias's throat tightened. "Who are you?" The figure blinked as if trying to pull his name from somewhere deep beneath centuries of silence. "I was a guest. They told me it would be brief." His gaze drifted toward the chapel window, where moonlight cut a cold line across the floor. "It was not brief." Matthias swallowed hard. "What did they do to you?" But the figure shook his head slowly, as though the memory itself weighed too heavily to lift. "Not here," he whispered. "They always listened here." The words chilled Matthias more deeply than any frost. The air shifted, and Matthias sensed the figure weakening. He set the lantern down and reached out instinctively, but the man recoiled from his touch, not in fear but in pain, as though warmth itself burned him. "Please," Matthias said gently, "tell me what happened in the lower chamber." The figure's eyes sharpened. "Do not open that door," he whispered. The chapel seemed to breathe around them, ancient wood creaking as a draft curled through the room. Matthias waited, pulse thundering, as the noblemen gathered enough strength to continue. "They took those who threatened power," he said. "Those whose voices mattered. They locked us below. Told our families we had chosen solitude, faith, repentance." His gaze flicked to the letter in Matthias's hand. "They forged our words, signed our names, and beneath the mountain, we were told to forget everything except silence." A mid-segment cliffhanger settled in the space between them. Matthias forced himself to ask, "How many were there?" The nobleman's expression twisted, grief, anger, exhaustion blending until they were indistinguishable. "7, when I first arrived." His voice dropped even lower. "But the mountain does not keep us whole." A shiver crawled up Matthias's spine. "You survived." The man's lips parted in a bitter approximation of a smile. "Survived," he echoed softly. A generous word. Before Matthias could ask more, the chapel door burst open. 2 guards stormed in, weapons drawn, shouting incoherently. The nobleman flinched, shrinking into the corner, hands raised in instinctive surrender. The guards froze only when Matthias stepped between them, shouting for silence. "No one touches him," Matthias ordered. But when he turned back to the corner, the figure was gone. The lantern still burned. The parchment still lay on the altar. But the space where the nobleman had stood was empty, as if he had dissolved into the stone itself. The guards swore they had not seen him move. No footsteps, no motion, no sound. Just disappearance. Matthias rushed into the hallway, scanning shadows, calling out, but the corridor gave no answer. The air had gone still, unnaturally still. By dawn, word had spread through the entire fortress. Servants refused to work. Guards demanded to be released from their posts. Several claimed to have seen the same figure wandering the battlements again. Always silent, always watching, always barefoot. But one detail united every report. Wherever he walked, Frost followed. In desperation, Matthias summoned Hartmann back to the castle. The historian arrived reluctantly, already shaken by his previous visit. When Matthias recounted the night's events, Hartmann listened with an expression that shifted slowly from fear to disbelief to something far more unsettling. Recognition. "Describe him," Hartmann said quietly. Matthias did. Hartmann's face drained of color. He reached into his satchel, producing a worn book containing portraits of minor European nobility. He flipped through the pages until his trembling finger stopped on a faded illustration. A young man, in a richly embroidered coat. The same coat Matthias had seen in the chapel. The caption read, "Lord Adrian Falkenreich, declared missing, 1532-2." Hartmann closed the book with shaking hands. "This confirms it," he whispered. The chamber was not a prison, it was a vault. "A vault for what?" Matthias demanded. Hartmann met his eyes, voice dropping to a fearful murmur. For men history needed to erase, without letting them die. Before Matthias could respond, another scream tore through the castle. This time, it came from the direction of the lower staircase. Matthias sprinted toward the ruined east wing, lantern swinging violently as he ran. The scream still echoed through the corridors, raw, panicked, abruptly cut off. When he reached the staircase, 2 guards stood frozen at the top, refusing to go any farther. One pointed down the steps with a trembling hand. "He went below," the guard whispered. Something pulled him. Matthias didn't wait for more. He descended, heart pounding, the cold thickening with every step until his breath turned to mist. At the bottom of the staircase, the corridor stretched before him, darker than he had ever seen it. His lantern flickered, not from lack of oil, but as though the air itself resisted the flame. And then he saw it. The lower door was open. Not broken. Not forced. Open, as neatly as if someone inside had turned the latch from within. Frost spilled out of the doorway in a long, delicate sheet, coating the floor in fragile white. Matthias stepped forward carefully, feeling the temperature drop in aching increments. The chamber beyond lay in total darkness. He whispered the guard's name. No answer. He whispered again, louder. Only silence. Summoning what courage he had left, Matthias lifted the lantern and stepped inside. The chamber was larger than he expected, carved directly into the mountain, its ceiling arching into blackness. The floor was rough stone, marked with etchings he couldn't decipher. Chains hung from the walls, ancient iron rings still embedded in the rock. A circle dominated the center of the room, carved with precision, enclosed by lines that intersected like a star. At the far end of the chamber, something moved. Not quickly, not with purpose. Just a subtle shift, like a man trying to remember how to stand after centuries of stillness. The nobleman, Lord Adrian, emerged from the shadows. Except he did not look as he had in the chapel. His posture sagged, his skin paler, his limbs unsteady. His expression was not angry or frightened. It was sorrowful. You opened it, he whispered. Matthias shook his head. I didn't. The door. But Adrian raised a hand gently. The mountain opens when it chooses. Matthias dared a step closer. What happened to the guard? Adrian hesitated, gaze drifting toward the deeper shadows of the chamber. He ran into the dark. I tried to stop him. He did not listen. Matthias lifted the lantern higher, illuminating more of the space. The shadows recoiled, retreating into corners as if alive. Adrian's voice trembled. This room was not meant for the living. Not in the way you understand it. Time behaves differently here. It fractures, folds, devours. Matthias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. How did you survive? Adrian met his eyes with a hollow, fragile calm. We were kept in cycles, waking, sleeping, forgetting. The mountain does not kill. It preserves. It keeps what history discards. A mid-segment cliffhanger tightened like a knot. Matthias tried to steady his breath. Why show yourself now? Why appear in the chapel? Why leave the letter? Adrian looked toward the corridor, as if expecting others to emerge behind Matthias. Because the door weakens. Because silence is ending. Because the world above moved on, but we never could. The cold deepened suddenly, rushing through the chamber like a breath inhaled by the mountain itself. Adrian stiffened. They are waking. Matthias's grip tightened on the lantern. Who? Adrian stepped back into the shadows. The others. A faint sound rose from the darkness, multiple breaths, ragged and unsteady. Then the scrape of stone. Footsteps. More than one. More than two. Many. Wall. Matthias retreated instinctively, lantern shaking, the flame shrinking under the weight of the cold. Shapes began to form in the black, figures emerging slowly, unsteadily, dressed in tattered garments from centuries past. Noblemen lost to history. Men recorded as dead, vanished, erased. They walked with the same frozen stillness Adrian had carried. Eyes hollow. Skin drained of color. Time had not passed for them so much as held them in its fist. Adrian raised a trembling hand toward Matthias, voice straining. You must close the door. Seal it. Forget this place. Forget us. Matthias shook his head desperately. I can't leave you here. Adrian's expression shifted, a tragic kindness crossing his face. You must. We are already gone. Figures advanced, slow but unstoppable, the cold following them like a tide. Matthias stumbled backward into the corridor, nearly dropping the lantern. The moment he crossed the threshold, the nobleman halted as if an invisible border restrained them. Adrian stepped forward one last time. Do not return. Then he retreated into the darkness. The lantern sputtered violently. Matthias seized the door and pulled with all his strength. Frost cracked beneath his hands. The wood groaned. And then, at last, it slammed shut, sealing the chamber in darkness once more. The corridor fell silent. Matthias staggered back up the stairs into the daylight, collapsing against the wall. The guards found him hours later, his hair streaked with frost, his voice nearly gone. He never spoke of what he saw again. Hohenwerfen Castle was restored in later years. Tourists walk its halls today, admiring the views, listening to guides speak of falconry and medieval life. No one mentions the lower chamber. No record of it appears on any tour map. But on cold mornings, some staff claim they still hear footsteps beneath the east wing. And sometimes, a quiet knock against a wooden door no one can find anymore.